Welcome into Words with Wallace. I'm your host, Nick Wallace, coming at you. It is Monday, October 7th. What is up, everybody? You guys remember a couple weeks ago when I said I was going to get back and locked in on this podcast feed, and then I did the exact opposite? Yeah, I remember too. But now we're locking back in for real, man, because the season is almost here, man. We are, 3 weeks away at this point in time? We had a blockbuster trade a couple weeks ago. I know it's like 10, 15 days old at this point, but whatever. It was an awesome deal between the Knicks and the Timberwolves. Karl Anthony Towns is a member of the New York Knicks, so we have to break that down. That's going to be the first thing we do once we get going on this here podcast. We will get back to like the off-season content, put a cherry on the ranking the top 10 players at each position, cover the big men probably in our next episode because we do have a little bit of time before the season starts. But it's almost here, man. I can't believe we got that deal. I was actually thinking about doing an emergency pod, but then I remembered, wait, I'm back home in Massachusetts, didn't have my mic with me. Congratulations to my guy, RJ. RJ, you remember my Celtics expert. We did have a bit of a wedding ceremony for him and his wonderful wife, Marley, so congratulations to them. So I was back home and had to get caught up on a few things, but now we're back. We're back and we're locked in. We're literally sitting here. It's a Monday night. I'm sweating out. Some fantasy football stuff taking place in the Chiefs game, just out here praying that Travis Kelce doesn't do anything. I feel like you have to be like a real sicko to just watch like a neutral football game if you don't have a rooting interest in either team, and you can only like lose your fantasy matchup, you can't gain any fantasy points, like you're probably into some weird stuff, dude. Like you're just kind of a sicko if you're watching that game. So that's what I'm not doing. I'm not thinking about my fantasy team. I'm here on this podcast talking about you guys. Now let's get locked in on some NBA stuff. So quick outline for this pod. Of course, we're going to talk about the cat trade. Then we're going to talk about all the crazy stuff in NBA media that's taken place over the last couple weeks. Then we have to talk about some NBA Media Day storylines with some of the top teams in the NBA. Had some retirements we got to cover. We'll get into all of that. But let's start off. Top of the lineup here, we have to talk about the New York Knicks and the Minnesota Timberwolves making a blockbuster trade. And again, this is just so rare to have two teams that I would argue are legitimate contenders swapping core pieces of their franchises and are so late into the NBA offseason. Like, it's really hard to imagine two teams doing this when the season is just a few weeks away. But the Knicks were involved, the Timberwolves were involved, and then the Hornets were involved as well, really just to, cop some second-round picks and just make sure all the salaries match perfectly with the new CBA. So let's just read all the trade details. First of which, the New York Knicks, they received Karl Anthony Towns and the draft rights to James Nagy, who came over from the Hornets. I believe he was like one of the first picks in the second round this past year's draft. The Timberwolves, they've received, of course, Julius Randle and Dante DiVincenzo. They also received Keita Bates-Diop and a future first-round pick from the Knicks to the Pistons, which is heavily protected. We are going to talk more about that in a little bit. And of course, the Hornets, they received Charlie Brown, which is kind of hilarious. I'm just now looking at that for the first time. Shout out Charlie Brown. And all the holidays are coming up. Gotta love those Peanuts classics. Daquan Jeffries also headed to the Knicks, as well as Dwayne Washington Jr. And then like 3 different second-round picks and then some cash. So what is my instant reaction to the trade, right? Because everybody needs to have that snap reaction. Who won and who lost the trade, which is literally impossible to do, by the way. We're not really going to know until we can measure the success of these teams over the next couple seasons. But because I need to tell you who won the trade right here, right now, the Knicks probably won the trade, right? Like they just did. They got the best player in the deal, and I don't think it's all that close, even though, look, I'm not the biggest cat guy. I'm also not the biggest Julius Randle guy either. And they addressed their obvious weakness, right? They needed a center so desperately. And they gave away like the one really talented player on their team that didn't quite fit with the core, didn't quite fit in with the Nova Knicks that they had going on there. But I must say, there is still a world where the Timberwolves are just as good, if not better, than what they were last year. So that's my instant reaction. Knicks won the trade. Timberwolves still might be better, but let's kind of dive into it a little bit. Because I think the reason the Knicks, you have to say they won the trade, is, again, they got the best player in the deal. And not only that, they just kind of addressed a position that's pretty hard to find. Now, they were dying for need at that center position really all offseason. That's why I wasn't as bullish on the Knicks before making this move, because they lost Isaiah Hartenstein, right, with the new CBA. Just to remind everybody, he ended up signing with the Thunder for like 3 years, $87 million, and the Knicks could really only offer him like 4 for $75 or something in that ballpark, right? So they lose Hartenstein, who was a main defensive anchor for the team, some guy that could really make plays with the ball in his hand as well. Just saw the court really well, wasn't obviously a great shooter. They're back up with Mitchell Robinson. It's announced that he's hurt. He's probably out until at least Christmas, and that dude's always banged up, even though he's pretty talented. They have Precious Achiuwa, great option. He was awesome during the playoffs, but he's only 6'8". And then the only other guy that they have there is Jericho Sims, who's like a really raw prospect. And so, look, I've never been a Towns guy, but he's an incredible offensive player. They get him in the building. He's a 7-footer that shoots 40% from three. And now he gets to play the position that made him even more unstoppable, right? Like, I think Cat's offensive production took a little bit of a dip the past couple seasons playing with Gobert because he was effectively playing a power forward position. Now he's even more of a matchup nightmare if your lumbering 7-foot tall guy has to then chase Karl Anthony Towns around the perimeter because he shoots over 40% from three. And so I think if anything, like, Towns is better positioned to produce even more offensively for the Knicks than he did in Minnesota. Because if you just look at the offensive talent, at least on paper for the New York Knicks, like, you don't have to worry about a Rudy Gobert being out there, right? Like, the spacing is always going to be better for the New York Knicks. You still have a really talented, on the ball creator in Jalen Brunson. And I just think they're going to ask Towns to do a bit more. So I think his life might even get easier, especially playing with somebody with Jalen Brunson who might be a little bit more dynamic of a playmaker than Anthony Edwards, at least this point in time. Like, Ant could blow him out of the water with that next season with the rate he's ascending. But regardless, I think the Knicks are going to be way better offensively because of this deal. Now, the elephant in the room, if you're going to look at the other side of the coin for the New York Knicks, you have to talk about the defense, right? And the defensive concerns that, you have when Karl Anthony Towns, who's long struggled on the defensive end of the court, is now your defensive anchor, so to speak. I just have to say, I think that's a little overblown because the Knicks were basically going to be screwed defensively no matter what the second that they lost Hartenstein, right? Like, until Mitchell Robinson comes back, the Knicks were always going to be in a bad place if, Precious Achiuwa was their starting center or, Julius Randle was guarding the other team's center. Like, it wasn't like that position they traded away, a huge part of their defensive identity to get Karl Anthony Towns, right? Like, they only traded away Julius Randle, Dante DiVincenzo, and a heavily protected pick. Like, that's really not much to give up in this deal. So, keeping it moving here to the defensive attention, I think that because the rest of the New York Knicks roster is a pretty talented defensive team, right? You have, of course, Mikal Bridges. You have OG Anunoby. You have Josh Hart. Like, three pretty close to, like, all-NBA level defenders guarding the other team's best player the majority of the time, really all of the time during the regular season. It's not going to be like an all-out sprint to the rim where Karl Anthony Towns is going to be challenged possession after possession at the basket and being asked to protect the rim. I just don't think that's going to happen a ton in the regular season anyways. There is worth noting that, look, the Knicks are worse defensively this upcoming season than what they were last year. There's really no doubt about that. But I think when it's not going to be until the playoffs where that really rears its ugly head, right? Because then you have Jalen Brunson, Karl Anthony Towns, the Knicks' two most talented offensive players, and also two worst defensive players. Like, Brunson's guy and Towns' guy are going to be in, like, the pick and roll every single time. Like, they're going to be constantly attacking those two and trying to avoid the other three at all costs. So that is going to happen. But if you're just looking at the Knicks and the concern about defense in the regular season, like, I still think, if anything, like, they're probably a slightly better defensive team after making this move than what they were before, because at least Cat is still 7 feet tall. He's still an extremely talented rebounder, which is an important part of playing defense as well. It's just collecting the ball after a miss. Like, he's going to be really good at that as well. Just kind of looking through the rest of my notes here. I mean, the Knicks are all in, as they should be, because Towns has 3 more years on his deal and then a player option, which we'll see if he ends up taking that. Probably not, with the way that the salaries just keep on increasing. But Randall was like the weird fit for the Nova Knicks, right? Like, he was just kind of the odd man out. Like, everyone's talking about, Brunson and Hart and DiVincenzo and Bridges and talking about the chemistry that those guys have. And then there's Randall. There's this guy that has just been averaging like 25 and 10 for like the past 4 years, and just nobody seems to know what to do with him. So it is tough to give up Dante as well, because he was kind of like arguably the other odd man out, even though he was a part of the Nova Knicks, right? Because there were reports, of course, after the trade that he was going to be the one to have to come off the bench. And the report said that Dante wasn't really happy about this. But I just don't know if I believe that. That just seems like hey, this is why we did it. And they're just trying to save face from the Knicks perspective, and the fact that the Nova Knicks were this big time thing and the 4 guys played a grand total of exactly 0 games together. But look, you had to give away another asset besides Julius Randle to make this deal work. I'm sure DiVincenzo was a huge selling point for the Minnesota Timberwolves. So if you had to pick one of those Nova guys to give away, it's probably him, even though DiVincenzo's coming off a career year where he's a really talented defender and shot the hell out of the ball from 3. So just in general, I already had the Knicks as like the second best team coming out of the East before this deal, to be totally honest with you. I just trusted their makeup better than Philadelphia to begin with. And now that they have Karl Anthony Towns, like, it's not even close. Now, I still am obviously going to go with my Boston Celtics over them, but I have to admit, as a Celtics fan, like the Knicks match up a lot better. The fact that they have like a real 5-out option to go to, let alone like that's just going to be their lineup the vast majority of the time. Like Towns is going to make things a lot harder to defend from the Knicks. Now they're also going to be easier to attack defensively, like we talked about. But look, the Knicks, they got a lot better. They still have some juice off the bench, right? Like they have McBride, who actually had some awesome moments in the playoffs. Precious will be nice coming into that bench role there. Eventually, when they get Mitchell Robinson back, he'll be kind of nice to have as like an option if somebody really is just exposing the shit out of Karl Anthony Towns and making life really hard for him on the defensive end. Like at least down the road before April, they should have Mitchell Robinson back in the rotation to be like more of a traditional rim protector, although he gives you nothing on the offensive end of the court. And then they have Shamet, who's looked good in some preseason games and campaigns. So it's not a good bench by any means, but I do think they still have enough depth there where they can probably survive as long as they don't suffer a crazy bad injury. So again, Knicks getting Karl Anthony Towns, I like it from their side. I think they clearly got a lot better. Now let's move on and talk about this deal from the perspective of the Minnesota Timberwolves. Now you guys know I have a lot of friends out in Minnesota, especially my guy Garrett Olson, who is quite literally one of the biggest Timberwolves fans on the planet. And honestly, the sentiment I've seen from not just Garrett, but really everybody that I've online that supports the Timberwolves is that they are crushed by this deal. Like a lot of people like around the league didn't necessarily love Cat, and there's definitely some real questions about how Cat's personality is going to fit in with the New York Knicks. But the Timberwolves fans loved him. Like he was their guy. He was their franchise cornerstone, obviously before Anthony Edwards. And the number one question that I just have from a Wolves fan that's probably hurting them the most is like, man, like, you're giving up Towns, like you're giving up one of your franchise cornerstones, and you couldn't get more than one shitty draft pick in this deal. Like you couldn't get multiple firsts involved. Like you just saw the price that you guys had to pay to go out and get Rudy Gobert. And the best you got is like a heavily protected pick from the Pistons. Matter of fact, let's just run through those protections real quick just so you guys understand. This is a heavily protected first round pick that is top 15. This is a pick of the Detroit Pistons, right? So this is likely a bottom feeder franchise, likely what is going to be at least a lottery pick for this upcoming season. Well, it's top 15 protected this year. It's top 11 protected next year. It's top 9 protected the following year. And then afterward, it would turn into a second round pick. So that being said, there's a very likely chance that this just ends up being like a distant second round pick. At the very least, it'll be like a late lottery or, mid first round pick if the Pistons somehow improve. So you really can't bank on that draft capital at all. But now you're asking the question, okay, why would the Wolves do that? They have like literally a top 2 season in franchise history, right? And then they go out and they trade away one of their 2 best players. And it is important to note how much money Karl Anthony Towns is making over the next couple of years, right? They were probably looking around with the new CBA, all the guys in their team that they have to pay. Of course, Anthony Edwards. Of course, they're going to want to pay Naz Reid. Of course, they have to pay Rudy Gobert. Of course, they are going to want to pay Jaden Daniels. Like they have a lot of franchise guys that they want to keep around that are essential to their identity. And they just kind of felt like Cats with the massive contract that he's already on the hook for. It just didn't make sense to keep him around instead of having that really brutal decisions to make in the offseason in a couple of years. And so Randall only has one more year on his deal and then a player option that he's likely going to end up opting out of because, again, he's just going to be able to make more money on the free agent market unless he gets hurt or anything crazy like that. So it does give them more flexibility, but it's just hard to imagine that's like the best they can do for Towns. But then again, all the Wolves fans out there also want to tell me that their general manager or president of basketball operations, whatever, Tim Connolly is a genius. And while everybody clowned him from the Gobert trade, he seemed to have the last laugh when they beat Denver in the Western Conference playoffs this past year. So we just have to keep that in mind. And so now that we've kind of aired it all out, they probably could have got more for Towns, but it probably came down to it being a financial decision. Now, where do the Wolves go for this year, right? Because again, I said before, they are a contender in the Western Conference. How can they possibly be better without Karl Anthony Towns? The answer is pretty simple, right? I think the first way you have to answer that question is Ant might just get better enough on his own where it doesn't even make a difference, right? Where even if Julius Randle is, 60% of what Karl Anthony Towns was, I know they're very different players. Ant just getting better on his own could be enough to just kind of lift all tides, and then they're just smooth sailing. The other thing to keep in mind is that, Randle is not a scrub, right? He was a weird fit in New York. He had, some questions with his work ethic and things of that nature. And just has really terrible body language whenever you seem to watch the New York Knicks and they lose. But the guy is no scrub. He's a walking 20 and 10. He's a really fantastic rebounder. He's a talented scorer down low. I think he actually uses his size and his ability to score in the low post. Might even be better than what Towns does, right? Towns is just kind of awkward and charges at the basket half the time he finishes down low if it's not off of like a lob or something, where like Randall has like a real skill set that he can go to like back to the basket that I think, Wolves fans are going to learn about very soon here. Now, the difference is like the spacing is going to be awkward. He's not nearly as talented as a shooter as Karl Anthony Towns, so that's important to keep in mind. But look, he's a really solid player. He's a really great secondary creator alongside Anthony Edwards, and so that's important to keep in mind. Now we talk about Dante DiVincenzo. That's a guy that they can immediately plug into potentially the starting lineup. Maybe they bring Mike Conley off the bench or something like that, or certainly are able to save a lot of miles on Mike Conley in the regular season because you're adding another guard in the rotation that's extremely talented defensively, can shoot over 40% from three, and honestly had real chops as a scorer, which we saw in the playoffs when the Knicks were so empty-handed. Like, he's just a really talented guy that's played on a lot of good teams throughout his college and professional career. Like, I think DiVincenzo was a massive part of this deal, and they just looked at adding to what was, a relatively thin guard rotation. You'd be asking a lot of Rob Dillingham as a rookie to step in and immediately make an impact. Now he can kind of come along a little bit slower now that you have Ant, Mike Conley, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, and Dante DiVincenzo in the mix now. So I like that as well. And I think the last thing we really need to talk about as to why the Timberwolves would want to do this deal is just their confidence in Naz Reid, right? Like, Naz Reid was incredible last year. And now his role might not be all that different this current season because you still have to start Julius Randle. You still have to start Rudy Gobert. So you're still looking like Naz Reid is going to come off the bench the vast majority of the time. But he was the reigning sixth man of the year for a reason. And I'm not saying he's better than Karl Anthony Towns because he's not. But there were like many different games throughout the regular season and the playoffs in which he was the better of him and Karl Anthony Towns. He was fantastic. He can still space the floor. He's talented attacking the hoop. Defensively, there's just as many concerns with Naz Reid as there are with Karl Towns. He's a little bit smaller and just not as great as a rebounder as Towns as well, so that's important to keep in mind. But like, bottom line is Naz Reid might end up being just like talent-wise like a top 7-8 big man in the entire NBA, at least from the center position anyways. Like, he's pretty damn good. And so eventually, if Randall does walk in the offseason, it's not going to come as a huge shock to the Minnesota Timberwolves. They might be comfortable letting him out the door knowing that their replacement, their true replacement for Karl Anthony Towns, was already in the building because Naz Reid is extremely talented and simply deserves a bigger role. Like, it's just that simple. Like, regardless of what you think of what his ceiling is, you really can't argue that on any other team in the NBA, he would be a starter and a guy that would be playing 30 plus minutes a night every night. So that is probably why the Wolves felt most comfortable doing it, but it's still kind of a stretch to be like, why do you have to take this leap right now? And so my final thoughts on the deal overall, I just think it is an awesome trade. And again, just have to ask ourselves, when's the last time we had two teams that were both contending and like swapped all-star caliber players? I was looking back, like maybe you could argue like the James Harden, Ben Simmons swap in 2022, but I don't know if that really counts because, then Ben Simmons immediately became a bum that just like posts Instagram pictures and off-season workout videos, and that's like it. And then I think besides that deal, you'd have to go back to like the really crazy summer of like 2019 in which a bunch of guys swapped teams and everything like that. So just in general, let's keep in mind that you can't really declare a winner on a trade like this, especially like any trade, let alone a trade like this right away when you do have two teams that have so many different moving parts and everything like that. So frankly, it wouldn't even surprise me if the Wolves just start off way better than the Knicks do, because the Knicks have now really changed their dynamic, adding in Karl Anthony Towns. Like, they had nobody in the building with that type of skill set, anything like that. I think the identity of the team was already a bit up in the air because they only had 30, 40 games with Anunoby last year. They've had 0 games with Mikal Bridges, the guy they got earlier in the offseason, right? There's just a lot of moving parts there in New York, and really only 3 weeks for them to get their act together before they're playing meaningful basketball in front of one of the largest fan bases in the world. Like, there are going to be growing pains in New York. There is no doubt about that. Whereas the Timberwolves, like, they have their identity. They have, the vast majority of the core is the same. The go-to guy is still going to be the same in Anthony Edwards. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if the Wolves and their defense and everything like that, that's mostly unchanged, is going to be just fantastic to start the regular season, and they have no hiccups at all. And then we're, pointing and laughing at this in like a couple weeks, like, wow, the Knicks thought they won the deal. Like, look at the Timberwolves. Like, this shit does not matter at all until at least after this upcoming playoffs. And even then, it's going to take a few years to actually measure how both of these deals work out. But really exciting trade. If I'm a Timberwolves fan, I just wish we could have got a little bit more draft capital to go along with the haul of the players. The players trade wasn't like a total nightmare by any means, but you just have to ask for more draft capital if you are giving up a guy that is under contract in the modern NBA and is still one of the only dudes on the planet that's 7 feet tall and can shoot 40% from three. You would have liked to see at least 1 or 2 real first-round picks in a deal like that. So that's my final thoughts on the Knicks Timberwolves trade. Let's move on because we had a really crazy week in NBA media, and I want to talk more about that. When I say NBA media, I'm really just talking about ESPN here. I'm not going to lie. They're the worldwide leader for a reason, and they've been in the headlines a lot lately. So let's talk about it here. It all started, like 2 weeks ago when Woj, out of nowhere, Adrian Wojnarowski, the leading newsbreaker in all of basketball, just out of nowhere, wakes up one morning, quits ESPN. Nobody saw it coming. Like, when I found out that he quit, I was in shock, obviously, as everybody else was. And then just, like, the manner in which he did it, like, he literally dropped, like, one final Woj bomb, and that's what was just like, I'm out, was just such a powerful move. Like, I just respected that so much. But the best part is now he's quitting. He's leaving the news and ESPN, everything like that. His entire life as he's known it for the past, like, probably like 20-something years now, behind him to become the general manager of his precious Bonnies. St. Bonaventures, his alma mater, he's going back to be the general manager, which is crazy. It was very hilarious because, like, if you had, like, notifications for Woj, it would be, like, trade, it would be, like, rumors, injury, and then, like, he'd just randomly, like, shout out the Bonnies for, like, a big win against, like, some mid-team that they were playing. And it was always hilarious. So, like, real ones knew that, like Woj was obviously an alumni of St. Bonaventures and he loved the Bonnies, but, like, the fact that he just, like, switched over, I thought was hilarious. And so I had to, like, think about it a little bit more because I'm like, okay, GM of the Bonnies, whatever. But I'm like, that's not a job. Like, NBA teams have GMs. Like, what the hell does a GM of college basketball do? But now with, like, the NIL and the recruiting and all that has changed so much where, like, these, student athletes are so obsessed with, like, getting the maximum amount of money possible, right? Getting the maximum amount of endorsements, getting the maximum amount of sponsorships. Like, you need somebody that's really well connected on top of that stuff. And who better to shepherd that in than Woj? And so, like, it's not like he's replacing a previous general manager. Like, they're making a position, and then now it's Woj. Like, could you imagine, like, being a student at St. Bonaventures or, like, a player on the team? Like, they're so up. Like, they're like, we have Woj in our building, like, looking out for our guys. Like, my bankroll's going up. Like, what if the Bonnies just become, like, a blue blood in, like, the next couple years? Like, I don't know, man. It's like crazier shit's happened, I guess. So I just thought that was hilarious. So shout out Woj because that's awesome. It's badass. I know a lot of people kind of made fun of, like, they had like this weird thing on ESPN where they brought in like Schefter and, Jeff Passan, and I'm probably forgetting about like the other newsbreakers that they brought in, but like they brought all the big newsbreakers in to like salute Woj and talk about the demand for the job, which some people made fun of, but I'm like, it really is no joke, man. Like, Woj is out there, maybe he's scheduling the tweets or whatever, but he's tweeting all hours of the night. Like, stuff's happening nonstop. Like, he's got to be there on a moment's notice. Like, it is a lot to be on call all the time, I'm sure. So for him to like step into a less taxing role and doing something he's really passionate about, where I'm sure he's going to leverage the success he's had over the past 20 years anyway, like, good for him. That's genuinely awesome. So started there. And I was just thinking, like, after Woj quit, I was like, man, like, to step into those shoes, like, they really got nobody for that job. Like, what's going to happen? And I just think in general, it's been a pretty awful year for ESPN's basketball coverage. Like, I have to come out and say it. I'm not going to lie. Like, you go back to like over a year ago before this past NBA season where they let go both Jeff Van Gundy and Mark Jackson. And then their A-team broadcast became still the GOAT, Mike Breen, no doubt about it, Doris Burke, and JJ Redick. That was now their A-team instead of Jeff Van Gundy and Mark Jackson. And I don't know, maybe I just am surrounded with too many like-minded people, but I really don't know a single person that enjoyed the Doris Burke, JJ Redick broadcast more than the previous rendition with Jeff Van Gundy and Mark Jackson. Like, I know that JJ's awesome on podcasts and he's awesome at so much other stuff. And we're going to talk about JJ in a second, but like him, like not knowing like the nuances of like getting in and out of a commercial break and like the amount of money that I would have paid when my Celtics were in the NBA finals to just hear, "Mama, there goes that man." Like, that's all I need in that moment, Like, it's just, Mark Jackson was so good at that, and Van Gundy actually really knew his stuff. So I miss those guys immediately, right? And they go all in on JJ Redick, and has his awesome podcast. And then, what do you know? Like, regardless of what you thought of him on the broadcast, like, JJ was an instrumental part of ESPN's basketball strategy. And they lose him to the Lakers. You can't really, lose too much sleep over that. If the Lakers call you to be the head coach, you kind of have to say yes, I guess. And then they lose Woj. And then this is what I don't feel bad for ESPN for, because I have to come out and say, like, terrible move. On all accounts, terrible move to just come out and fire Zach Lowe, who I do think that his podcast is probably like 1 million times better than mine, but I do think there is a world in which I kind of emulate some of the same stuff that Zach Lowe does, because he's really engaging, he's really talented, he clearly watches the games, like his opinion really matters. He's not just saying stuff just to get hot takes. And so I loved Zach Lowe. He's one of my favorite people in all of NBA media. And his podcast, The Low Post, which was very popular on ESPN, is no more, right? Like, they basically said that he was in the same round of layoffs as like Sam Ponder and RG3 and stuff like that. And so, it was just like company layoffs. They were looking at Zach Lowe's salary. They didn't want to pay it, and they let him go. I obviously have absolutely zero insight into that or why that happened, but that was just how it was reported that it came out. And so Zach Lowe is gone. I was pissed about that. I was really disappointed in the network, because it seems like ESPN is headed in a direction of just, really what does well on social media. And in some ways, like, maybe you respect them for it, right? Like the Kendrick Perkins and the Stephen A. Smiths and the people of that ilk that just kind of say some crazy stuff and they have a fun debate. And I think there's definitely a time and place for that in sports talk media. Like, if I had to be on the air all day long, like, you can't just, be talking about like the Rockets, like pick and roll coverage, like on a loop. Like, sometimes you want to have a LeBron Jordan debate. Sometimes you just want to be like, is Tatum top 5, and have a real debate about that. Like, I get it, but I just think that if you don't have like that balance where you're also having like guys like Zach Lowe in the mix that are real thinkers, and for people like myself, people who really watch the game and enjoy listening to others who watch the game, like, and you just have an absence of that on your network. Like, I already thought their pregame show was already getting their ass kicked by Inside the NBA, so there's really no doubt about that. And so it just felt like they were picking a direction, that they were moving away from like the more analytical, like, game watching side of things to just hot takey debate type format. That's just the direction it seemed to be take. And maybe I can't get mad at ESPN. Maybe I just have to get mad at like the general basketball fan, because people tell you what they want. They tell you what gets views. They tell you what gets clicks. They tell you what gets engagement on social media. Maybe that's an audience problem. Maybe it's a social media problem. But it seemed like ESPN was heading in that direction. So I was pretty upset with that. I still hate the Zach Lowe move. Like, that guy, first of all, I should say, is going to be fine. Like, it's actually kind of shocking that this news came out like about a week ago and we haven't heard his next landing spot. Like, maybe it's The Ringer, maybe it's The Athletic, like maybe it's Yahoo. I don't know. But whoever gets Zach Lowe is going to be very lucky to have him. Like, that guy's going to land on his feet. He's going to be just fine. But I was just thinking, I'm like, man, like, going back to Woj and like the absence of the news space, like, who is it going to be, right? Like, we're losing Woj bombs like for a couple days there. Really seemed like we weren't going to have Woj bombs. We were going to have breaking wind, right? Like, you got to think that Brian Windhorst, Windy, is going to be stepping in as their top newsbreaker. It just seems like that's where we're headed. And I was like, good for him, because I think Windy's incredible. Like, there's still so many incredibly talented people at ESPN. Like, Bobby Marks breaks news from time to time. He's an insider. He's incredible with like the salary cap breakdowns. Legler on like the post game stuff with SVP is like a master at work. Like, he's the same guy kind of from that like Zach Lowe cloth, except he actually played in the NBA, which is fantastic. And then out of nowhere, ESPN's like, nope, it's not gonna be Windy, Bobby. We got Shams. They went out and they got the only other guy who could really compete to step into Woj's role right away. Like, there was always that little rivalry between Woj and Shams, which was funny. Like, they would go back and forth during the NBA drafts. They'd be like, people would keep track of who broke more like free agent news, like in early July and stuff like that. And it just so happened that, shout out Shams and his agent. I have no idea how much his contract with ESPN is worth, but like, what a wonderful time for his contract with The Athletic to be coming up. Like, Woj, it just comes up like right as Woj quits out of nowhere. Like, the bidding war for Shams was probably insane, because if you care about having a newsbreaker, being the one to report on those stories, if you want to see ESPN's logo attached to that first article when, Kevin Durant demands his 4th trade, like, you got to have the guy. You got to have one of the few guys in the space with that Rolodex of contacts. And I guess Shams was certainly the top fit, and they went out and they got him. So that was actually announced earlier today that Shams is coming to ESPN. I don't think anything's been reported on like the details of his contract, how long he's with the network, whatever. But it's going to be the same thing as what we could expect from Shams before, except now ESPN maintains, they sub out Woj. He moves on to greener pastures. Good luck to him with the Bonnies. And then Shams comes over to ESPN. So, pretty crazy week for ESPN. Luckily, they were able to replace Woj. I am still interested to see what they do differently with like the pregame and the postgame shows, and like if they do hire anyone else that's like a similar type of Zach Lowe guy. But guys like that are hard to find. So, interesting to see what direction ESPN heads. But they certainly are feeling a lot better this week than what they did a couple weeks ago after losing Woj. Other NBA news before we get out of here, I did want to kind of mix up the order of this podcast a little bit, give you guys what you came for at the top of the pod, and then just kind of freeball it at the end here. So that's kind of what we're doing. So other news, Derrick Rose retired within the last week, which literally everybody loves Derrick Rose, which is very interesting. Like, obviously incredible and also extremely sad career. It's always really cool just in all the sports, not just basketball, but when guys have the opportunity to be a professional athlete in their hometown, like for their hometown team. And Rose and like the Chicago connection, like that is all time stuff. Like that's never going to get broken. I will never understand that. Never really had that opportunity to watch a true hometown athlete like that, especially like I don't even live in the city of the teams that I root for anymore. So I just know that connection that Rose has to Chicago is different. But I do have to say, like Rose, like I know he's in general really well liked because the highlight tape is crazy and just like the sad nature of his career. But like the diehard Derrick Rose fans, like not to be confused with like the diehard Bulls fans, like they've always been like a little weird and over the top. Like, can I just say that? Can I always just say that like Derrick Rose's weird fans have kind of turned me off to Derrick Rose, which you could say that about basically every basketball athlete with the way that like Stan Twitter has like evolved and stuff like that. But like I literally remember, and if Connor's listening to this, he can remember too. We were at like at Coach Dennis Jackson's camp in Amherst, Massachusetts. Coach Dennis Jackson, one of the all-time great basketball instructors, love that guy. We're at his camp in 2009, and this kid, I don't remember the kid, everybody hated this kid, but he was like a diehard Derrick Rose fan, rocking the D Rose Memphis jersey, like straight face was coming up to everybody and was like, Derrick Rose is going to be the best player in the NBA as a rookie. Like to everybody. Like this was again weeks after Derrick Rose had gotten drafted. We're at a basketball camp and this kid is just spitting nonsense. And I'm like, I want to hit this kid with my fists. And then like 2 years in, we're like, that guy was kind of spitting. Like he was right. Like, oh my gosh. And then move forward, 20 some odd years, whatever. And like people are on just Twitter are like describing his like post-injury career as like him as like an elite sixth man. And I'm like, like he had some great moments post-injuries and everything like that. And I remember the 50-point game from the Timberwolves. I actually just watched the highlights of that the other day and like all that stuff. But I'm like, to say that he was ever an elite sixth man with like what? The Cavs and the Grizzlies and the Knicks and the Timberwolves, like he was never that. He was never that. And the other people that are weird and talking about how he's like low key and unspoken after he has like a professionally produced retirement video where he's like holding a rose and I know it's his last name. It's just a little weird. That I cannot. It's probably my last chance to be able to really talk about Derrick Rose in this podcast. There's a weird obsession with him. He's got some skeletons in the closet. I don't even want to get into with the academic stuff and some sexual assault stuff. Like, I don't know if that's like the guy that we all just 100% we're all in no matter what. That's all I'm saying. I think it's a little weird. Incredible career. Still the youngest MVP in league history. And, he will get into the Basketball Hall of Fame. That much is basically guaranteed. Like, the standards to get in the NBA are extremely low. There's far less talented players that are in the Basketball Hall of Fame. Derrick Rose will be in Springfield pretty soon. And then finally, I don't like ending things on a sad note. I guess we'll talk about this news before closing it up with some NBA media stories. But I do have to say, rest in peace to Dikembe Mutombo, man. Like, one of like the coolest, most iconic, and beloved players in NBA history. I don't take any of those things lightly. Like, a dude that in my life watching basketball, like he was like a household name, like as early as I can remember. I don't have a very good memory, but I really cannot remember a time in which I was engaged with basketball and did not know who Dikembe Mutombo was. And like, he played a long ass time. He played until he was 43 years old. He played basketball in the NBA until like 2008, 2009. Like he was with the Rockets for several years at the end there when he was obviously a shell of what he was in Atlanta and Denver and everything like that. But so I was like, man, like when I heard he had passed of brain cancer, I'm like how I was almost shocked to see that he was already in his 50s because I'm like, I felt like he was just playing. Like I really did feel like that. And so it's just a really sad passing. Obviously he had his health issues, but like everything we're going to remember Dikembe for was like he was in some incredible ads. He was like, doing the finger wag and like the cereal commercials. He was a massive ambassador for basketball, like all of like the charitable work he did, giving back to, people in his home country, giving back to young folks trying to get involved with basketball, like all of that. And then in a separate bucket, I would also be remiss to not mention like his merch went crazy. Objectively, I actually am really bummed because like the news that Dikembe pass came out right after I was coming back from Massachusetts. I still have a pair of Mutombo shoes by Adidas in my parents' house that I would have loved to bring back with me because I should have brought them back with me anyway. Like the Dikembe Mutombo logo, like look it up if you guys haven't seen it. It's incredible. Like all of his merch from back in the day went incredibly hard. I saw a lot of pictures on Twitter. And so, yeah, I mean, he's just a dude that was an all-time center, like one of the all-time leaders in blocks. A defensive anchor, and a dude that is just because of his behavior on the court, like the finger wag. We're going to see that a ton this season. Like that's going to have a resurgence, obviously for sad reason, but it deserves to make a resurgence because he was awesome. And despite being like a pretty arrogant personality on the court, like everybody just loved him. They loved his laugh. They loved, everything that he stood for off the court. Like just an all-time guy. So it's just really sad to see him pass, especially with how he was still really involved in the game. He was still working with the league on a lot of different fronts. And so, obviously, rest in peace to one of the GOATs, Dikembe Mutombo. And then finally, let's just wrap it up with some random like NBA media stories that we've seen over the past couple days. I've seen a lot of buzz over the past couple weeks about like Tatum's fixed jump shot. I know there was a lot of like, off-season analysis on his jumper and like the hitch and like the shooting form. And it is funny how like, I obviously watch the vast majority of the time that Jason Tatum plays basketball. I will watch it. And it's like how even I like don't notice like when you over time how his jump shot changes and like you have to be reminded of like what his shot looked like several years ago. I'm just really sick of hearing about it. I don't really have a take on his jumper besides like who cares, man? Like I understand it's not the most efficient jumper. I am team anti ugly jumper. I hate when jumpers are ugly, and I don't think Tatum's jumper was ever ugly. I do think he developed some of a hitch and now it's fixed. I really could care less. I don't think it was obvious to the point where it really made a difference. I don't think his shot, even post fixing the hitch from the videos I've seen, is going to be like marginally quicker. So all I really care about is if it's not going to be marginally quicker, then I just hope it's going to be more effective. Hopefully he breaks out of like the shooting slump that he showed during the Olympics and toward the end of last regular season. But frankly, I'm not too worried about. This is just one of those storylines that hopefully blows away a couple weeks into the season. Hopefully Tatum can get close to like high 30s percentage from three, maybe even crack 40%. And I will be absolutely thrilled. Some other news I thought was funny was like the news out of Milwaukee that Dame and Giannis did not meet up at all this summer. Like that was just known. I don't remember if it was Dame or Giannis said so, but kind of damning for a Bucks team that really needs to get on the same page, and it just starts and ends with their top duo of Dame Lillard and Giannis. It kind of makes sense with Giannis playing for Greece in the Olympics. I know Dame was not a part of Team USA, but it's kind of a bummer when it was reported that the previous offseason Dame like wasn't working out because he was worried that he was going to get hurt in the midst of all the trade rumors and everything like that. And so for them not to have like a formal offseason where they're playing consistent basketball, kind of scary, but it also kind of makes sense given the Olympic commitment that a lot of teams were dealing with. But for a Bucks team that desperately needs to get on the same page, that's certainly not good news. Going back to the ugly jumper thing, I don't know how I didn't notice this. Has Mikal Bridges' jumper always been that ugly? Like, I feel like I've watched a decent amount of him and didn't realize how ugly his jumper was. And all the videos I've seen of him shooting in the offseason looks horribly ugly and horribly slow. And so I just wanted to throw that out there. A little bit lower on Mikal Bridges, not going to lie. He's still going to be out there 82 games, play elite defense, be a really talented player for the Knicks. I just don't like ugly jumpers. So do with that information what you will. And then finally, the most notable piece of media that came out around Media Day was the news on Luka's calf, because this is obviously a guy who was, Mavs fans were banging the drum that, all throughout the playoffs he was hurt and all during the, regular season he was banged up, and just a guy that's been perennially banged up for the past, calendar year at least. And so, Mavs fans were hopeful that he would, take it easy in the offseason and just needed a full offseason of rest, and he got the exact opposite, right? He was literally the last team in the NBA playing basketball alongside the Boston Celtics in the NBA Finals, and then he transitions right into the Olympics. And so, of course, his country got bounced pretty early on in the Olympics. They didn't even qualify, but still, like, that's times in practice, that's times traveling, that's times in the gym, whatever. And then it's announced that he recently had, like, an issue with the calf. And that's really scary for, again, not to tie it too much into NFL. This isn't an NFL podcast, but like, calf injuries and the history of them being linked to issues with the Achilles, everything of that nature. We just saw what happened with Christian McCaffrey. His stuff with the calf injury, it was a calf injury all offseason. Then we get to week one. Now it's his Achilles, and he's going to Germany to see some weird specialists. So I'm just throwing it out there. Calf injuries are scary. They've played Kevin Durant. They've played DeMarcus Cousins and many other NBA players throughout the years. So I know Mavs fans are terrified about that. There's really not much updates at this time. He wasn't expected to get a lot of rest in an Olympic basketball summer. He obviously is very passionate about playing for his home country, as he should be. But that is one final piece of news that I wanted to note. Finally, the last thing that I wanted to talk about was the start of the NBA preseason. Now, I consider myself a real ball watcher over here, right? And even I rarely dabble in the preseason basketball streets, right? Like I just kind of wait, this is football time. It's one of the only times of the year before I get super locked in the NBA season. It's not usually till opening night unless there's some crazy storylines or injury news I have to be on the lookout for in the preseason. But so I really don't watch. But it is just unbelievable the bag that the NBA must have received for the start of the preseason in Abu Dhabi, because they didn't just get a random preseason game to play in Dubai. No, they got arguably two of the marquee teams in the NBA right now. They got my Boston Celtics and the Denver Nuggets to square off in not one but two preseason games over there in Abu Dhabi, which is just insane. And I need to ask my audience, because I don't know. I guess I could look up preseason box scores in previous seasons. But that being said, how rare is it that the starters actually play a decent amount of minutes in these games? Because I'm looking at the box scores here. I haven't had a chance to watch them yet. I know the first game was close. Celtics won them both. Not a big deal. They got a full 20 minutes from every relevant, healthy player on both teams besides what? Al Horford, as far as I can tell here. Like, they got 20 minutes from Jokic, 20 minutes from Tatum, 20 minutes from Brown. Like, everybody's out here balling in these games. And so that oil money that the NBA must have taken from Dubai in order just to make this game happen must have been generational. That is really my last thoughts. Maybe I'll watch these games and let you know if anything exciting happens on the next episode. But I just wanted to close that out, that, NFL isn't afraid to take that money to play a game in Brazil. NBA is like, hold my beer. Maybe we'll get these. I know, as a matter of fact, that we'll be getting regular season games overseas in Dubai and other places like that over the next couple seasons, because clearly there's a market for it. And I'm sure the money that the NBA got just to have a couple preseason games over there is ridiculous. And I have to put on my conspiracy hat and be like, hey, if we're getting this much money from the games, tell Jokic to warm him up. Like, he's playing. Like, Tatum, lace him up, buddy. Like, you guys are going out there for 20 minutes a night. Because it wasn't just, 20 minutes of Peyton Pritchard and the Maine Red Claws. No, they got the full allotment of healthy starters on both sides of the ball. So I thought that was absolutely nuts, and I had to comment on that, and I will report back after I watch that. But I have to go. I got to go sweat out the rest of this Monday Night Football game. I will be back next week, most likely to wrap up the final installment of our offseason rankings, ranking the top 10 big men in the NBA. Before I let you guys go, be sure to follow Words with Wallace on everything that includes Spotify, Apple Music, wherever you get your podcasts. Also on social media, on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok. Be sure to follow the show there, engage with all the content. That way I can grow this wonderful podcast. And I will talk to you guys next week. Peace.